Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. Old Fashioned Ghost Stories, Volume 3, Story Number 1. Those in the motor car hardly felt the slight though sickening impact. It was rather indeed because of the instinct for something gone wrong than because of conviction that he had struck anything more important than a roll of tangled burlap from some passing moving van, that the driver brought his heavy car to a stop with a grinding of brakes strenuously applied, and he went back to see what he had struck. He had turned the corner almost incidentally, but when he alighted and went back, when the thin gleam of his flashlight revealed to him the heap of huddled pulp which lay there, the driver realized in the throes of a hideous nausea that it was his heavy machine had spurned and crushed. Roger Phillips, intent upon the first really decent act of his whole life, hardly noticed what was forward. He had been crossing the street. He continued to be intent on his own concerns, interrupted only by a kind of cold shudder to which he gave only passing thought, as if with the very outer edge of his mind. He did not stop, but crossed the sidewalk, looking up as he had done many times before to reassure himself that the lights were out in the living room of the apartment up there on the third floor of the apartment house. They were out, as he had confidently anticipated, and reassured, he quickly mounted the steps to the front entrance. Someone came out hurriedly and passed him as he entered, the rush taking him by surprise. He turned his head as quickly as he could to avoid recognition. It was old Mr. Ostler, his father's neighbor, who had rushed out. The elderly man was in his shirt sleeves and appeared greatly agitated, so much so that young Phillips was certain he had not been recognized. Hardly even noticed, indeed. He breathed an audible sigh of relief. He did not want old Ostler to mention this chance meeting to his father the next time he should see him, and he knew Ostler to be garrulous. The young man mounted lightly and hurriedly the 2 flights of steps that led to the door of his father's apartment. He thrust his key into the patent lock of the apartment door confidently, almost without thought, a mechanical motion. As mechanically he turned the key to the right, it was an old key, and it fitted the keyhole easily. He knew that his father and mother were at the symphony concert. They had not missed one for years during the season for symphony concerts, and this was their regular night. He had chosen this night for that reason. He knew the maid was out too. He had seen her not 5 minutes earlier getting on a car for Boston. The coast, as he phrased the thought of himself, somewhat melodramatically, was clear. He was certain of security from interruption. Only let him get safely into the apartment, do what he had to do, and as quietly and unobtrusively depart, and he would be satisfied, quite satisfied. But the lock offered unexpected resistance. It was inexplicable, irritating. His over-tense nerves revolted abruptly at this check. The key had slipped into the slot, as always without difficulty, but it would not turn. Furiously he twisted it this way and that. At last he removed it and stared at it curiously. There was nothing amiss with the key. Could his father have changed the lock? Anger and quick shame smote him suddenly. He looked closely at the lock. No, it was unchanged. There were the numberless tiny scratch marks of innumerable insertions. It was the same. Gingerly, carefully, he inserted the key again. He turned it to the right. Of course it turned to the right. He remembered that clearly. He had so turned it countless times. It would not move. He put all his puny strength, and still it would not turn. Hot exasperation shook him. As he swore under his breath in his irritation at this bar to the fulfillment of his purpose, he became for the first time conscious of a rising commotion in the street below, and he paused irresolutely and listened, his nerves suddenly strung out. Many voices seemed to be mingling, and the excited hum that came to his ears, bits of phrases even, could be distinguished. Something had happened down there, it seemed. As he listened, the commotion of spoken sound resolved itself into a tone which upon his subconscious effort to analyze it, seemed to him to express horror and commiseration with an overtone of fear. The fear communicated itself to him. He shook as the voice of the growing throng, a blended corporate voice, came up to him in sickening waves of apprehension. What if this should mean an interruption? Impatiently wrenching himself away from the preoccupation and back to his more immediate concern with the door, he thrust the key into the lock a third time, this time aggressively, violently. Again he tried to snap the lock. Again it resisted him, unaccountably, devilishly, as it seemed to him. Then, in his pause of desperation, he thought he heard his own name spoken. He could feel his face go white, the roots of his hair prickle. He listened intently, crouching cat-like there on the empty landing before the door of his father's apartment. And as he listened, every nerve intent, he heard the entrance door below flung open, and the corporate voice of the throng outside, hitherto muffled and faint, came to him suddenly in a wave of sound jumbled and obscure as a whole, but with certain strident voices strangely clear and distinct. A shuffle of heavy feet came to his ears as if several persons were entering the lower hallway, their footsteps falling heavily on the tiled flooring. They would be coming upstairs. He shrank back against the door, that devilish door. If only he could get it open. Something like this, he told himself, in a wave of self-pity that swept him. Something like this, unexpected, unforeseen, unreasonable, something like this was always happening to him. That door. It was an epitome of his futile, worthless life. That had happened to him just the same kind of thing a month ago when he had been turned out of his home. The events of the intervening weeks rushed galloping through his overtense mind, and now, as ever since that debacle, there was present with him a kind of unforgettable vision of his mother, his poor mother, her face covered with the tears which she made no effort to wipe away, his poor mother looking at him, stricken through those tears which blurred her face. And there was his father, the kindly face, set now in a stern mask, pale and with deep lines. His father telling him that this was the end. There would be no public prosecution. Was he not their son? But he must go now. His home would be no longer his home. He recalled the days that followed, the mechanical activities of his daily employment, his search, half-hearted, for a furnished room. He recalled shuddering the several times when, moved by the mechanism of long-established usage, he had nearly taken an Alston car for home, which was to be no longer his home. He had not sent back the key. He could not tell why he had kept it. He had forgotten to hand it back to his father when he left, and his father doubtless unthinkingly had not suggested its return. That was why he still had it. And here he stood, now on the very threshold of that place which had been home to him for so many years, about to make the restitution that would do something to remove the saddest of all the blots on his conscience. And he could not get in. The men, talking with hushed voices, had reached the first landing. Young Phillips, caught by a sudden gust of abject terror, shrank against the stubborn door, the door which unaccountably he could not open. Then, his mind readjusting itself, he remembered that he had no reason for concealment, for fear, even though he might be seen here, even though these people should be coming all the way up the stairs. It could not matter. Let him be seen. What of it? He was supposed to live here, of course. It was only a short time since he had actually ceased to live here. And his father had said nothing. No public charge had been made against him. How one's conscience could make one a coward. Under the invigorating stress of this reaction, he straightened himself, stood up boldly, realizing that it might appear odd for him to be discovered standing here aimlessly on the landing. He started to go downstairs, but by now the narrow staircase was completely blocked by the ascending group. He stopped halfway from the flight. The men were carrying something heavy and of considerable bulk, it would seem. He could not see clearly in the dim light just what it was. He stopped halfway down, but none of the men carrying the awkward bundle, covered with what looked like an automobile curtain, looked up nor appeared to notice him. Neither did the straggling group of men and a woman or two who were following them. Fascinated, he gazed at what they were carrying. As he approached and turned the turn in the stairs, so that the electric light on the upper landing shone more directly upon it, he looked closer. It was the body of a man. It hung limp and ungainly in their somewhat awkward grasp as they shouldered up toward him. Something about it seemed vaguely familiar, the details presenting themselves to his fascinated gaze in rapid succession. The trouser ends, the shoes. The men turned the last corner in the winding stairway and came into full view. As they turned the corner, the leather curtain slipped and the face of the dead man was for a moment exposed to view. Roger Philip looked at it, fascinated, horrified. Then one of the men, halting for an instant, drew the corner of the curtain over the face again, and he could no longer see it. The head rolled. The broken body had been grievously crushed. Roger Phillips, utterly distraught, cowered, a limp heap against the unyielding door of his father's apartment. He had looked for one horrific instant into his own distorted, dead face. The men, breathing hard, reached the landing. One of them, gingerly shifting his portion of the burden upon the shoulder of another, stepped forward to ring the bell of the Phillips apartment. No one answered the ring, and the man rang again, impatiently, insistently. The bell trilled inside the empty apartment. The men stood silently, shifting uneasily from one foot to another. Behind them, a thin mutter came from the waiting stragglers, who had followed them, moved by an inordinate curiosity. "Here's a key sticking in the door," said the man who had rung the bell. "Guess we'd be all right if we opened the door and took the young fellow in. There doesn't seem to be anyone home." A murmur of assent came from the other men. He turned the key to the left and to the right, and the door opened. They carried the broken body inside and carefully laid it out on the sofa in the living room. Story number 2. All day long he rested, while the guns thundered in the village below. Then in the slanting shadows of the late afternoon, the rumbling echoes faded into the distance, and he knew it was over. The American advance had crossed the river. They were gone at last, and it was safe once more. Above the village, in the crumbling ruins of the great chateau atop the wooded hillside, Count Barsac emerged from the crypt. The Count was tall and thin, cadaverously thin, in a manner most hideously appropriate. His face and hands had a waxen pallor. His hair was dark, but not as dark as his eyes and the hollows beneath them. His cloak was black, and the sole touch of color about his person was the vivid redness of his lips when they curled in a smile. He was smiling now, in the twilight, for it was time to play the game. The name of the game was death, and the Count had played it many times. He had played it in Paris, on the stage of the Grand Guignol. His name had been plain Eric Heron then, but still he'd won a certain renown for his interpretation of bizarre roles. Then the war had come, and with it his opportunity. Long before the Germans took Paris, he joined their underground, working long and well. As an actor, he'd been invaluable. And this, of course, was his ultimate reward. To play the supreme role, not on the stage, but in real life. To play without the artifice of spotlights, in true darkness. This was the actor's dream come true. He had even helped to fashion the plot. Simplicity itself, he told his German superiors. Chateau Barsac had been deserted since the Revolution. None of the peasants from the village dared to venture near it, even in daylight, because of the legend. It is said, you see, that the last Count Barsac was a vampire. And so it was arranged. The shortwave transmitter had been set up in the large crypt beneath the chateau, with 3 skilled operators in attendance, working in shifts, and he, Count Barsac, in charge of the entire operation as guardian angel, rather, as guardian demon. "There is a graveyard on the hillside below," he informed them, "a humble resting place for poor and ignorant people. It contains a single imposing crypt, the ancestral tomb of the Barsacs. We shall open that crypt, remove the remains of the last count, and allow the villagers to discover that the coffin is empty. They will never dare come near the spot or the chateau again, because this will prove that the legend is true. Count Barsac is a vampire and walks once more." The question came then, what if there are skeptics? What if someone does not believe? And he had his answer ready. "They will believe, for at night I shall walk, I, Count Barsac." After they saw him in the makeup, wearing the black cloak, there were no more questions. The role was his. The role was his, and he played it well. The Count nodded to himself as he climbed the stairs and entered the roofless foyer of the chateau, where only a configuration of cobwebs veiled the radiance of the rising moon. Now, of course, the curtain must come down. If the American advance had swept past the village below, it was time to make one's bow and exit, and that too had been well arranged. During the German withdrawal, another advantageous use had been made of the tomb in the graveyard. A cache of Air Marshal Göring's art treasures now rested safely and undisturbed within the crypt. A truck had been placed in the chateau. Even now, the three wireless operators would be playing new parts, driving the truck down the hillside to the tomb, placing the objets d'art in it. By the time the Count arrived there, everything would be packed. They would then don the stolen American Army uniforms, carry the forged identifications and permits, drive through the lines across the river, and rejoin the German forces at a predesignated spot. Nothing had been left to chance, someday when he wrote his memoirs. But there was not time to consider that now. The Count glanced up through the gaping aperture in the ruined roof. The moon was high. It was time to leave. In a way, he hated to go. Where others saw only dust and cobwebs, he saw stage, the setting of his finest performance. Playing a vampire's role had not addicted him to the taste of blood, but as an actor he enjoyed the taste of triumph, and he had triumphed here. Parting is such sweet sorrow. Shakespeare's line. Shakespeare, who had written of ghosts and witches, of bloody apparitions, because Shakespeare knew that his audiences, the stupid masses, believed in such things, just as they still believe today. A great actor could always make them believe. The Count moved into the shadowy darkness outside the entrance of the chateau. He started down the pathway toward the beckoning trees. It was here, amid the trees, that he had come upon Raymond one evening weeks ago. Raymond had been his most appreciative audience, a stern, dignified, white-haired elderly man, mayor of the village of Barsac. But there had been nothing dignified about the old fool when he caught sight of the Count looming up before him out of the night. He screamed like a woman and ran. Probably Raymond had been prowling around, intent on poaching, but all that had been forgotten after his encounter in the woods. The mayor was the one to thank for spreading the rumors that the Count was again abroad. He and Clodes, the oafish miller, had then led an armed band to the graveyard and entered the Barsac tomb. What a fright they got when they discovered the Count's coffin open and empty. The coffin had contained only dust that had been scattered to the winds, but they could not know that, nor could they know about what had happened to Suzanne. The Count was passing the banks of the small stream now. Here, on another evening, he'd found the girl, Raymond's daughter, as luck would have it, in an embrace with young Antoine Lefebvre, her lover. Antoine's shadow leg had invalidated him out of the army, but he ran like a deer when he glimpsed the cloaked and grinning Count. Suzanne had been left behind, and that was unfortunate because it was necessary to dispose of her. Her body had been buried in the woods beneath great stones, and there was no question of discovery. Still, it was a regrettable incident. In the end, however, everything was for the best. Now, silly, superstitious Raymond was doubly convinced that the vampire walked. He had seen the creature himself, had seen the empty tomb and the open coffin. His own daughter had disappeared. At his command, none dared venture near the graveyard, the woods, or the chateau beyond. Poor Raymond. He was not even a mayor anymore. His village had been destroyed in the bombardment. Just an ignorant, broken old man mumbling his idiotic nonsense about the living dead. The Count smiled and walked on, his cloak fluttering in the breeze, casting about like shadow on the pathway before him. He could see the graveyard now, the tilted tombstones rising from the earth like leprous fingers rotting in the moonlight. His smile faded. He did not like such thoughts. Perhaps the greatest tribute to his talent as an actor lay in his actual aversion to death, to darkness and what lurked in the night. He hated the sight of blood. Had developed within himself an almost claustrophobic dread of the confinement of the crypt. Yes, it had been a great role, but he was thankful it was ending. It would be good to play the man once more and cast off the creature he had created. As he approached the crypt, he saw the truck waiting in the shadows. The entrance to the tomb was open, but no sounds issued from it. That meant his colleagues had completed their task of loading and were ready to go. All that remained now was to change his clothing, remove the makeup, and depart. The Count moved to the darkened truck, and then they were upon him, and he felt the times of the pitchfork bite into his back, and as the flash of lanterns dazzled his eyes, he heard the stern command. Don't move. He didn't move. He could only stare as they surrounded him. Antoine, Claudez, Raymond, and the others, a dozen peasants from the village, a dozen armed peasants glaring at him in mingled rage and fear, holding him at bay. But how could they dare? The American corporal stepped forward. That was the answer, of course. The American corporal and another man in uniform, armed with a sniper's rifle. They were responsible. He didn't even have to see the riddled corpses of the three shortwave operators piled in the back of the truck to understand what had happened. They'd stumbled on his men while they worked, shot them down, then summoned the villagers. Now they were jabbering questions at him, in English, of course. He understood English, but he knew better than to reply. Who are you? Were these men working under your orders? Where were you going with this truck? The Count smiled and shook his head. After a while he stopped, as he knew they would. The corporal turned to his companions. Okay, he said. Let's go. The other man nodded and climbed into the cab of the truck as the motor coughed into life. The corporal moved to join him, then turned to Raymond. We're taking this across the river, he said. Hang on to our friend here. They'll be sending a guard detail for him within an hour. Raymond nodded. The truck drove off into the darkness, and as it was dark now, the moon had vanished behind the cloud. The Count's smile vanished too, as he glanced around at his captors. A rabble of stupid clods, surly and ignorant, but armed, no chance of escaping, and they kept staring at him and mumbling. Take him into the tomb. It was Raymond who spoke, and they obeyed, prodding their captive forward with pitchforks. That was when the Count recognized the first faint ray of hope, for they prodded him almost gingerly, no man coming close, and when he glared at them, their eyes dropped. They were putting him the crypt because they were afraid of him. Now the Americans were gone, they feared him once more, feared his presence and his power. After all, in their eyes he was a vampire. He might turn into a bat and vanish entirely, so they wanted him in the tomb for safekeeping. The Count shrugged, smiled his most sinister smile, and bared his teeth. They shrank back as he entered the doorway. He turned and on impulse unfurled his cape. It was an instinctive final gesture in keeping with his role, and it provoked the appropriate response. They moaned, and old Raymond crossed himself. It was better in a way than any applause. In the darkness of the crypt, the Count permitted himself to relax a trifle. He was off stage now. A pity he had not been able to make his exit the way he planned, but such were the fortunes of war. Soon he'd be taken to the American headquarters and interrogated. Undoubtedly there would be some unpleasant moments, but the worst that could befall him was a few months in a prison camp, and even the Americans must bow to him in appreciation when they heard the story of his masterful deception. It was dark in the crypt and musty. The Count moved about restlessly. His knee grazed the edge of the empty coffin set on a trestle in the tomb. He shuddered involuntarily, loosening his cape at the throat. It would be good to remove it, good to be out of here, good to shed the role of a vampire forever. He played it well, but now he was anxious to be gone. There was a mumbling audible from outside, mingled with another and less identifiable noise, a scraping sound. The Count moved to the closed door of the crypt and listened intently, but now there was only silence. What were the fools doing out there? He wished the Americans would hurry back. It was too hot in here. And why the sudden silence? Perhaps they'd gone. Yes, that was it. The Americans had told them to wait and guard him, but they were afraid. They really believed he was a vampire. Old Raymond had convinced them of that. So they'd run off. They'd run off. And he was free. He could escape now. So the Count opened the door, and he saw them there. Saw them standing and waiting. Old Raymond staring sternly for a moment before he moved forward. He was holding something in his hand, and the Count recognized it, remembering the scraping sound that he'd heard. It was a long wooden stake with a sharp point. Then he opened his mouth to scream, telling them it was only a trick. He was no vampire. They were a pack of superstitious fools. But all the while they bore him back into the crypt, lifting him up and thrusting him into the open coffin, holding him there as the grim-faced Raymond raised the pointed stake above his heart. It was only when the stake came down that he realized there's such a thing as playing a role too well. Next story. You really think I'm that different, do you? Oh, I know you meant it as a compliment, don't worry. But seeing as how we've known each other for so long now, I'll give you your due, and a warning at the same time that you won't believe a word of it. And I won't mind if you laugh, or raise an eyebrow or two. As a matter of fact, I'll be disappointed if you don't. I'm a fair man, I think, and you really should know what you're getting yourself into. No, of course, I'm not trying to break tomorrow's engagement. But as I said, I'm a fair man. Can't you see it in my eyes? So, where should I begin? With a woman, I suppose, though I hope you won't be jealous. It's all very pertinent, believe me it is. What it comes down to, I think, is that I remember Alicia Chu. Not because of the experience we shared, but because it was she who stopped me from even dreaming about marriage again, or about love in the sense you would ordinarily consider it. Unrequited passion? I hardly think so, though I've considered it, that's true. That sounds too much like a line from a grade B 1940s film, though if I were pressed, I would have to admit that in a grotesquely perverse way, I may love her yet. Or part of me does anyway. But that's the one thing I can't explain just now. I'm not even sure that I'll ever have the answer. The attraction certainly was in her astonishing, almost exquisite beauty. I told you not to be jealous. Be patient. Though that too lingers, rather like an aftertaste, uncommitted to being either sweet or sour. And if that sounds odd to say in this day and age, it's because she herself was a strange one. In a way only someone like myself can truly appreciate. As of this moment, to be frank, I honestly cannot think of exactly what it was about her that affected me first, despite the apparent simplicity of the problem. But then perhaps I'm still too close to the situation after 10 short years. Tell you what, let's turn this into a game of sorts. You order yourself another one of those pink things. None for me, thanks, perhaps later. And we'll pretend we're in one of those 19th century country inns, whiling away the evening, scaring the hell out of each other with nonsensical ghost stories. I haven't much time, but I think I can give you a hint of what's coming. Not that I expect that you'll take it. No one ever does. Which is odd, my dear, because it's not only happening to me. If you'll remember, it was a remarkably short time before the photography studio I opened downtown was doing extremely well for its rather limited size. Over the first few months, I'd been commissioned to shoot cover material for just about every men's and general circulation magazine going. There were even a few location trips to Europe thrown in to sweeten the lot. But when July came around, I felt myself going stale. My head was beginning to feel groggy in the same way you feel when you've just completed 2 or 3 finals exams in a row. Every model was getting the same vapid, hurry up you creep, these lights are hot look. Every location was flat and uninviting. I dreaded going to work, dreaded even waking up in the morning. And naturally, all this eventually surfaced in the final product. I'd obviously been pushing too hard, too fast, trying to make a few bucks and a name. Finally, when the very thought of sticking my eye anywhere near a lens made me want to gag, I said to hell with it, and I left. Oh, a few clients squealed and wrung their hot little hands. A few editors growled at me over the phone, but when I told them all in the plainest, non-advertising language what they could do with their precious campaigns and covers, all they did was purse their lips and shake their heads and tell me I needed a vacation. So I took one, as simple as that. I packed a bag and fled the city without looking back. It had been some time since I'd bothered driving with the top down, and the wind cresting over the windshield felt absolutely great. Just cool enough to take the sting out of the hot sun, and strong enough to make me feel glad I still had on my hair. Everything then, and every miserable working day was blown so far away, I had to think to remember what I did for a living. Knowing me as you do, you're not going to believe this, but I was even singing out loud at the top of my voice and thinking I should have practiced for the Met. Whim chose my direction, and I paid little attention to the odometer, gladly patching a tire to myself simply because there was no appointment I had to make by 2 o'clock, or we'll cancel the contract and find someone else more reliable, thank you. God, but that was a magnificent feeling. And the second morning out, in fact, I'd stuffed my watch into the glove compartment and didn't put it on again for 3 days. It's almost supernatural. The freedom one feels when you don't turn your wrist every 10 minutes to see that 10 minutes have passed since the last time you looked. Incredible and wonderful. But then, by hook, crook, or some other heavy handed and cliche scarred beck of fate's temptation, I found myself missing a few familiar comforts and ended up back in the Cape Cod I bought over there on Hawthorne Street, right on the river above the bend. I guess I had it in the back of my mind all along, in spite of the fact that my conscious plan was just to keep driving until I refueled. You should pardon the pun. I picked it up already furnished, but I never had a chance to really enjoy the overstuffed chairs and the dusty bookcases, the stereo, the TV, and God knows what else. I'd seldom stayed there more than just to sleep, and sometimes not that, if you know what I mean. But now, Lord, I could roam through the cool and quiet, let that old place soak out of my system everything that drive in the country hadn't banished. I turned myself into the absolute sloth, and I loved it. Every minute, even fell in love with the shadows in the house. And though I wasn't used to making things easy for myself, I had no problem at all falling into the slow, casual tempo of summer neighborhood life. Early evening walks, really seeing the place where I'd chosen to live, scuffing leaves in the park, and listening to bandstand music after a leisurely cooked dinner, once even stringing a hammock between two trees in the yard and humming in time to the river that marked the end of my lot. It was beautiful because for I don't know how many champagne days, I was actually seeing things through my own eyes instead of a camera's, and I was totally convinced I couldn't have been happier. Then one afternoon I was baking in a sauce of suntan oil on a small section of riverbank set aside as a beach. I spent a lot of good time watching the kids splashing around, dunking each other, and really getting frustrated learning to swim in the river's moderate currents. For a while there, I really got involved rooting for one little guy who was experimenting, holding his breath and trying not to drown at the same time. I was timing him by counting thousands and making bets with myself when this indescribable pair of legs blocked my view. Now, I know that some men are devotees of the décolletage, and others are, as one of my girls once put it, admirers of ass, but I prefer those anatomical delights that carry the rest of the woman around. It has always been my solemn creed that bust or buttock, nose or navel, aren't anything at all without a fine pair of legs to support them. Not that this woman didn't have the appropriate accessories, mind you, but Lord, those legs. All the Tories in history would have gladly fallen for them, would have definitely been singed by the rest of her. Curiously, she was wearing a one-piece bathing suit that would have aroused attention on any beach simply because it was so out of place. It was quaint. Black, too, her hair curled inward slightly at the ends and cut to a point between her shoulders. I lay there quietly, waiting for her to turn around and paradoxically hoping that she would stay facing the water. But she turned abruptly and looked straight into my eyes, as I do now, so I can see you're not jealous. Disconcerted though I was, her stare wasn't at all unfriendly. She was Eurasian, so temptingly French, perhaps, so tantalizingly Oriental, perhaps, that a dozen years' concentration couldn't have discovered where one began and the other left off. When I sat up, she knelt directly in front of me and smiled, her deep tan looking darker in the shadow of her lips. I felt a bit fuzzy, as if I'd had too much sun and beer, but I managed a weak grin in return. Obviously, I wasn't at the top of my form. "I'm sorry," I said, thinking all the while how brilliant that sounded and how stupidly 17-ish I was feeling. "For what?" She laughed, clear into eyes perfectly framed by black bangs. "You got me. For staring at you, I guess. It's not exactly the most polite form of introduction." She laughed again, tossing her head from side to side, and damned if I didn't feel shocked at myself. Right at that moment, I wanted to rape that animal. There's no other word. Kneeling so primly, not a hand's breadth from my feet, I know you know me well enough to understand that I'm not one to get upset over an occasional erotic impulse, but the sheer force of that woman had to be felt to be believed. And while I was smothering in this sense overload trance, she covered her mouth with silver painted nails and swung around on her heels until she was resting on the grass beside me, which is how we spent the rest of the afternoon. Seduction without words. Except, most of the time, I tried to stay just a few inches behind her to avoid her eyes. Alicia Chu, eyes brown black, with a single gold fleck in each, just off center. And when I finally introduced myself, she said, "Carol is an odd name for a man, isn't it?" Her voice was less a purr than a growl lurking beneath thin velvet. "Your father must have been a very handsome man." The touch of her hand on my knee, thigh, shoulder, the gentle way she brushed my back was colder than the lotion she rubbed absently into my skin. Cobra and mouse. Once she kissed the back of my neck, and I nearly grabbed a mirror from a passing woman to see if I'd been branded. Everyone smiled at us. The adults at me, the children at her. What a handsome couple, I knew they were thinking. It was only natural then that I asked her to dinner. She wouldn't tell me where she was staying, a wise precaution for a woman alone, but promised to meet me at my place at 7. We parted and I ran. You're laughing, but I did. I ran home and stood in front of the bedroom mirror thinking that all that had happened was far too good to be even remotely true. I scowled at my reflection, too much hair for a smallish head, eyes too blue, nose too long and too sharp, ears too close to my head. No leading man, that was for certain, and thus no physical reason why Alicia should clasp me so suddenly to her not insubstantial bosom. I laughed aloud. "By God, Carol," I said to myself, "you've been picked up. You've actually been picked up by a raving nymphomaniac, a psychotic murderess. I couldn't have cared less. She was elegantly available and I was on vacation. What I hadn't planned on, of course, was falling in love. And that is the wrong place to laugh, my dear. It was marvelous, right out of Hollywood, magnificent and terrifying. If I'd listened to myself then, I wouldn't be telling you this now. So she came, and we drove to a riverbank restaurant in a hotel in the next town, dined and danced and stood on the balcony that faced the water. I kissed her cheek, felt giddy with the wine, kissed her lips, and when it was over I was drained, so drained that I had to lean against the marble railing to keep from collapsing. For one second, hardly worth mentioning then, I hated her. Then it was over and we headed back to my home. There had been no innuendo conversation. The slight turn of her mouth, the graceful flow of her hand spoke for her. She never asked about my job, family, income, or Taylor. I myself had been too stunned by what I thought was instant love to mumble even a hello and "you look wonderful" and "why don't we dance?" I never felt the pain that lanced my will. Neither do I remember the drive back to the house, the opening of the door, the walk upstairs. I couldn't help but feel as if the world had wound down to slow motion, so languid her movements, so careful the display of her smile and her charm. She sat on the edge of the bed and gestured toward the chair I kept by the nightstand. "Drink?" Why not, I thought. Get bombed. Carol, and let's get on with whoever is raping who. "Of course," I said, mixed what she asked, and finally at last she let me sit down. We toasted each other, and I loved her again. Then her gaze narrowed over the top of the champagne glass, and I realized with a slow start that I spent most of the afternoon avoiding those eyes, all the evening losing myself in them. But when, as an experiment in masculine control, I tried to break away, I couldn't, and my palms became unaccountably moist. "Carol is a strange name," she said. "You already said that once, Alicia," I said, grinning stupidly. It was my dear departed mother's idea, not knowing what she would have at the time and not feeling like coming up with two sets for the sexes. "I love you, strange name," she whispered. Not a word out of place, not a change in tone. Something broke briefly through the sparkling cloud I felt over me, but I couldn't put a name to it and so shrugged it away. Instead, I emptied the glass and set it on the floor beside me, cleared my throat and said, "This is going to sound, well, it's going to sound ridiculous under the circumstances, Alicia, but damn it, I think I love you too." It was all so bloody serious, so intolerably solemn that I wanted to laugh, but I couldn't. I was too nervous, not of breaking the spell that night and champagne and mysterious women weaved, but of her in those eyes with their single flecks of gold. For how long, strange name? Shouldn't that be obvious? Forever, how else? It was she who laughed then, deeply in her throat, and as she did, I became inexplicably angry. Didn't she know? I demanded of myself that in 34 goddamn years on this road, I'd said that only once before when I'd meant it. To a cheerleader in high school, who had also laughed, but loudly and shrilly with her head thrown back and her eyes rolled heavenward in total disbelief. Strange name. Love me, Alicia said. I hesitated, I stalled. Her request became a demand. And I did, and am now regrettably forced to resort to the old purpose prose lines of jungle passions and animal ferocity. But that, I'm afraid, is exactly the way it was. Stripped, perspiring even before we began, stalking each other without benefit of cinematic love play, manual directions of foreplay and stimulation, sheets and blankets were literally torn, glasses were shattered, bottles smashed, again and again and again and again. Love me, she hissed. And I did. Bleeding, drawing blood, bruised and bruising, again and again. More, she crooned. I did. God, I did. Dawn, and I did not see it. Dusk, and I could not see it. Crying, laughing, a haze of cigarette smoke, a waste paper basket gushing uneaten meals one of us had made downstairs in the kitchen. It must have been her. I couldn't have moved. We stood by the window in caftan robes and watched the river pass, a beautiful bright day beneath us. Beneath the willows, it was peaceful and wonderful. I held her gently against my chest and told her so, whispering in her ear all the idiot love phrases that men think original when the loving is done. Then love me, she whispered back. The radio played Brahms and Vaughan Williams. Nothing louder for this room, on this day, at this time. Love me, she sang. I told her how, when I was in college up there in Hartford, I had exhausted myself during one summer vacation, visiting 10 European cities in less than 16 days. I must have been drunk when I said it. I don't remember now, but I suddenly turned mawkish and sentimental, muttering, "Those were the good old days," over and over again, and praising their lack of tears and responsibility, extolling my love for them in dreams and bursts of unbidden nostalgia. I told her about an Irish setter I once had, how he would never go with us on vacation because he always got car sick and had to stay at the vet's, about the cheerleader, about the models, about the slices of my soul that went into my work. Love me, she comforted. Everything is relative, said the speeding turtle to the snail. There must have been time someplace, but 2 days were gone before I first began to think that I was losing my mind. Alicia was sleeping at my side, peacefully, evenly. My mouth was burlap, my head cement, and God, dear God, how everything ached. For one nauseating moment I thought of a morning a couple of years back when I'd eaten Taten food in a Boston fast food joint and they used a full stomach pump while I was semi-conscious. I groaned and pushed myself up on my elbow, looking for a mirror to see if in fact I was really turning into an airless balloon. But a pain I knew instantly was frighteningly abnormal flattened me like a hammer, and I had to gasp for breath. Beyond that, however, I felt nothing. I registered the room and what I could see through the windows, but there was nothing left inside me to hang the pictures on. That, I think, is when the terror began. As if I were suffering a malaria attack, I simultaneously grew cold and soaked the sheets with a bath of perspiration that made me tremble, and I grew still more terrified when I tried to cry out with that slow-growing pain in my mind, and there was no reason, and my mouth made no sound. I fell asleep then, unwillingly, and I dreamt as I do now, in blacks and grays, and splashes of sterile white, and once in that dream I heard someone mention food, and I heaved dryly for 10 minutes before I could fall asleep again. The last thing I recall seeing was a floating broken camera. I woke once more. I think it was daylight. I really don't know because Alicia was bending over me, her lips parted and smiling. "Can you love me, strange name?" she asked, carelessly tracing a meaningless pattern from my chest to my stomach, to my groin and back. My God, Alicia. "Can you love?" she insisted. "My God, no!" She pouted through a smile that told me she knew better. "Alicia, please. You don't love me anymore?" a fleeting array of artfully shadowed images of Alicia in her gown, the swimsuit, the robe, her nakedness, atavistic in the arousal it produced, all made me smile lazily until I turned my head and saw the look in her eyes. And in that final moment before she smiled again, I knew at last what I had been trying to avoid. Alicia was still hungry, and she kissed me hard before I finally passed out. So then, before you tell me what you think, my dear, let me tell you what I think you've already decided. Let's see, maybe I'm simply crazy, right? Ah, too easy. Perhaps then it's fantasy, cleverly manipulated to hide a disastrous affair. Or better yet, perhaps I had become so drunk at dinner that I was physically incapable of playing the Don Juan in anything more than high-sounding words, thus striking myself low with assorted simple trauma. I was right, wasn't I? Well, it all sounds very intelligent, I admit, all very up-to-date and properly sophisticated. In fact, if I didn't have to hurry along right now, you might even have convinced me, given enough time. But I really must run, as I warned you at the start. And for heaven's sake, stop worrying about my health. I'll promise you now, if you like, that I'll dine without fail later this evening. Ah, my darling, you are jealous, aren't you? But you know me. First things first, so please don't worry. I won't forget. You see, there's this wonderfully attractive brunette named Claire who's dying to see the river from my bedroom. Look, why don't you have another drink on me, and I'll see you tomorrow. I've worked up a marvelous appetite talking with you, and Claire is waiting for me right this moment. I think you'd like her. She's a wonderful girl, a great girl. She thinks she's gold in my eyes is sexy. She loves me, she really does. But just so you'll know that I will keep my promise, lean over here and I'll give you a kiss. One kiss, that's all. One kiss. I'm hungry.